There is a rusting hulk in the middle of one of the world's busiest and most combustible patches of water. It flies the Philippine flag. It is crewed by a rotating detachment of Filipino Marines by any conventional measure. It is a wreck hull riddled with holes, waves slapping through its lower decks, not under its own power since the 1990s, and never moving again.
But the ship is also something else. A deliberate, stubborn, and dangerous piece of strategy. It is the BRP Sierra Madre, and where it sits, on Second Thomas Shoal, known in the Philippines as Ayungin, is the fulcrum of a contest that will help define Asia's next decade. In 1999, Manila made a choice.
It ran a former American World War II landing ship aground on a submerged reef 105 nautical miles west of Palawan and declared it a permanent naval installation. The object was not chosen because it could fight. It was chosen because, as battered and temporary as it was, it transformed a piece of unoccupied seabed into a piece of contested territory. A commissioned warship carries sovereign immunities. An attack on that ship risks becoming an attack on the state that flies this flag. In a region where ambiguity can be turned into control, that legal and symbolic shield matters. To understand why a rotting vessel matters so much, you have to see the pattern Beijing has repeatedly used elsewhere in the South China Sea. The playbook is elegant in its cruelty: show up, apply non-kinetic pressure, create new facts on the water, normalize them over time, and move to the next feature. The international arbitration ruling of 2016, formerly the South China Sea arbitration, undercut key elements of China's claims by finding that many features could not generate the sweeping maritime entitlements Beijing asserted. Beijing rejected that ruling outright, but the legal defeat did not stop a physical program, artificial islands, military installations, and gradual denial of access. The Sierra Madre was Manila's answer to that incremental advance, an attempt to make the cost of a racing Philippine presence politically and legally higher than the gains of simply towing a rusting ship away. What followed at Second Thomas Shoal was not an open battle so much as a long public test of will. Over the last decade and beyond, China has tried to make life untenable for the Marines aboard the Sierra Madre by using the full toolkit of gray zone operations. Coast Guard and maritime militia both circle and shadow resupply missions. Vessels position themselves to block access. Water cannons are aimed. Small boat rammings and dangerous close maneuvers have become a regular risk for the Philippine crews attempting to deliver food and water. There have been laser incidents, physical boardings, and an escalation of tactics designed to raise the cost of keeping a presence until the rusting hull collapses on its own. These actions are not isolated accidents. They are part of a deliberate calculus that aims to achieve what a naval engagement would risk destroying: plausible deniability, steady pressure, and the slow normalization of a new status quo. Some of the confrontations have been stark and alarming. In February 2023, Philippine officials said a China Coast Guard vessel directed a military-grade green laser at a Philippine Coast Guard ship during a resupply operation. A tactic that the Philippine side described as temporarily blinding crew members and as a blatant violation of safe conduct at sea.
The episode drew public condemnation from Manila's allies and a formal diplomatic protest. It was a reminder that the gray zone tools can produce real bodily harm, even when both sides avoid a shooting war.
The pressure did not stop. Incidents in 2023 and 2024 included close quarters rammings and, in June 2024, what Manila described as a violent boarding of a Philippine rigid hulled inflatable by Chinese. Personnel, an episode that produced injured sailors, seized equipment, and fresh accusations of escalation. That June event marked a threshold. It was the first time, many analysts argue, that Chinese personnel had physically boarded Philippine vessels in that part of the sea in a way that represented a meaningful intensification of tactics. It forced Manila and its partners to ask whether the strategy of incremental coercion had run into a limit. And yet, for reasons that are both legal and political, Beijing has stopped short of simply towing the Sierra Madre away. On paper, China possesses the maritime capacity to remove a rusting hull from a submerged shoal. but doing so would reach past the gray zone into a direct challenge of sovereignty over a commissioned warship, an act that could trigger treaty obligations and alliance. Reactions that Beijing has spent years trying to avoid. Instead, the Chinese approach has been to inflict enough hardship that Manila might quietly withdraw and attempt to achieve the same territorial outcome without crossing the threshold that would unmistakably be an act of war. That makes Second Thomas Shoal the real test. What happens when the gray zone ladder reaches its top rung and the gradual approach stops delivering results? That tension between what a state can do and what it is willing to do is what turns a patched-together hull into strategic leverage. Manila has kept its presence not because it can militarily match Beijing in the South China Sea, but because of a combination of political resolve, a transparency strategy that makes coercive acts visible in near real time, and an alliance architecture that magnifies the consequences of outright attacks. Every time a Philippine supply mission has been interfered with, Manila has made it public, allowing audiences in Washington, Tokyo, Canberra, and capitals across Southeast Asia to weigh Chinese behavior against international norms. That scrutiny matters. It changes the political cost calculus for Beijing whenever an incident edges closer to armed conflict. It gives small acts of resistance an outsized diplomatic value. This is not to exaggerate the Philippines' capacity. Manila could not outgun China at sea. The Sierra Madre remains, in a practical military sense, a relic. But its strategic logic rests on two things: presence and alliances. Presence because an occupied feature is harder to claim by force or politics, and alliances because the apparent willingness of partners to monitor, protest, and, if necessary, respond imposes constraints on how far coercion can be pushed without inviting broader consequences. The combination of physical human presence that refuses to yield, amplified by diplomatic and military backing, has been the only thing that has repeatedly stopped the South China Sea playbook from translating into straightforward acquisition. In July 2024, after several dangerous run-ins, Beijing and Manila reached what both sides described as a provisional arrangement to reduce misunderstandings during resupply operations, an uneasy temporary truce that allowed resupply missions to proceed with fewer direct clashes. But provisional is the operative word. The arrangement did not resolve the underlying claims. China still insists structures like the Sierra Madre should not be there. The Philippines still insists it has the legal right to maintain them. And Beijing still rejects the 2016 arbitration ruling that limited its maritime claims.
The pause changed the tempo, not the outcome. It gave both sides breathing room and allowed Manila to carry out essential repairs and rotations, while giving Beijing a chance to frame the arrangement in diplomatic terms that suggested concession and cooperation, even if Manila's position remained unchanged. There are, however, two clocks running now.
The first is physical. The Sierra Madre is old, and the corrosive sea is steadily doing what time does to iron. The Philippine Navy has carried out reinforcement and repair work, but a World War II-era landing ship was never meant to be a permanent garrison. Its structural integrity is a real operational concern. The second clock is political. How long will China wait before concluding that the provisional arrangement has exhausted its usefulness? What degree of patience does Beijing afford the slow erosion strategy before it considers a riskier, more visible move? The answers to those twin clocks will determine whether the next phase is more the same or an inflection into something more consequential. Beyond kinetic and legal pressure, there is a new and alarming development that suggests the contest may be widening into environmental coercion. In April 2026, Philippine authorities and national security officials announced that they had seized containers believed to contain cyanide from boats operating near the Sierra Madre at Ayungin Shoal. The allegation was clear. If cyanide was being used as alleged, it would represent an escalation not just against personnel, but against the marine ecosystem and the livelihoods of the communities that depend on fishing in those waters. Manila denounced the act and framed it as part of a broader pattern of hostile activity intended to intimidate and degrade the conditions for Philippine presence. Beijing denied claims that would portray its forces as engaging in such chemical tactics, and Manila rejected suggestions that any evidence had been staged. The accusation, true or not, shifts the narrative into a new and morally fraught domain where environmental harm becomes a weapon. If the cyanide allegation holds up under independent scrutiny, it would change how regional and extra-regional players think about escalation management. Environmental damage is not an abstract policy point. It is a direct assault on food security, livelihoods, and the economic basis for coastal societies. It is also visible in ways that are difficult to deny: dead fish, damaged reef, and the long tail of recovery. The optics of such an action would broaden the circle of actors willing to intervene, at least diplomatically and economically, and it would complicate any calculus that viewed coercion as a narrow, reversible instrument. So where does this leave us? Second Thomas Shoal is not merely about a single damaged hull. It is a test case for whether China's strategy of incremental, often deniable pressure has a limit. If the combination of presence, political will, and alliance credibility is sufficient to stop that strategy, the Sierra Madre will stand as proof that small states with international support and clear visibility can slow or blunt coercion in the maritime commons. If that formula fails, if the provisional arrangements break down, if the hull collapses, or if Beijing decides the costs of a clearer intervention are acceptable, the consequences will reverberate across Southeast Asia. Other claimants will watch closely. Strategic hedges will be recalibrated. Partnerships may deepen. Arms transfers and new deployments could follow. The calculus of deterrence in the region would shift. There are a few concrete things to watch in the near term. First, the structural integrity of the Sierra Madre. How many more repairs can it take, and what happens if a critical failure forces Manila's hand? Second, the tenor of resupply missions. Will the provisional arrangement hold, or will Beijing test it with renewed pressure? Third, the diplomatic and military posture of key partners. Any acceleration in Japanese military assistance to the Philippines, for instance, would change Beijing's strategic calculations and could create new deterrent dynamics. Fourth, the environmental allegations. If investigations into cyanide-like substances produce clear, independent verification, the moral and legal stakes of the dispute will rise. Each of these factors could transform a single rusting ship into the spark for much broader shifts. This is not a story that will announce its next move in advance. Gray zone competition by design seeks to test limits without triggering outright war. That makes it precisely the kind of contest that demands sustained attention, because small acts repeated can produce a strategic outcome greater than the sum of their parts. The BRP Sierra Madre is, in a sense, an experiment in whether sovereignty can be preserved through presence and alliances rather than through firepower alone. The experiment has not yet failed, but it is not over. The coming months will tell whether patience, transparency, and international scrutiny are enough to hold back a steady tide of coercion, or whether Beijing decides the provisional pause has served its purpose and chooses a riskier path. For now, the ship remains. The Marines rotate on and off. Supply runs continue under watchful eyes. Diplomats trade protests and demarches. Analysts tally incidents and test scenarios. Fishermen cast nets in waters made uncertain by politics. The floating emblem of sovereignty rusts a little more each season, and every new dent becomes a page in a larger strategic book. What happens to the Sierra Madre will not be an isolated news item. It will be an indicator of what Asian geopolitics looks like in practice, whether incremental coercion can be pushed to its logical conclusion without crossing into open conflict, or whether the limits of gray zone tactics are finally being reached. If you care about the stability of maritime order in Asia, if you care about whether small states can enforce rights against larger neighbors through presence and partnerships, then Second Thomas Shoal deserves attention. It is a lesson in how law, alliance, and the simple stubbornness of a few service members can sometimes change the calculus of power. It is also a reminder that the most consequential moves in international politics are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the slow, deliberate, and persistent acts that force other actors to decide how far they are willing to go. Listen to what the rusting steel says: presence matters, resolve matters, and in a contest defined by the spaces between war and peace, those things may be the only things that keep the peace from crashing.